I'm going to talk about the Sharjah. Well, let's get that up. Can we get the slideshow? There we go. I'm going to talk about the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, which opened in November and closes in just 9 days' time. The Triennial is the first major international platform on architecture to look at the architecture of the Global South. As curator of the first edition, I proposed a theme, which was rights of future generations. I tried to do this in order to foreground the intergenerational relationship in terms of struggles for environmental and spatial justice in the Global South. And part of doing that meant a kind of decolonization of what we mean by architecture in the first place. I think it's important to say that the Global South is not a region. It's an archipelago that has survived empire, colonialism, capitalist extraction. Each island in that archipelago embodies a struggle to sustain alternative ways of being in the world, a rebellion against extinction, we could say, that's been going for centuries. So the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, and you can see some clips of it up here, gathers works by architects, artists, activists, choreographers, anthropologists, scientists, and performers to try to tell the story of these struggles. Each project explores a unique relationship between generations, raising questions about the climate crisis and architecture's broader environmental role. One of the most emblematic projects in the Triennial is an 8 by 10 meter painting produced by 40 artists in 4 indigenous communities. The painting has lived in this large box at the bottom left of the screen, in the storeroom of the Munkaja Art Centre in Fitzroy Crossing for almost 23 years. And how the painting came into existence is a rather astonishing story, so I want to try to share it with you today. In order to tell it, we have to turn to another kind of island, not one in an archipelago, but rather a continent, with its own settler colonial history and an untold narrative which is as vast as its landmass. The legal case of Marber versus Queensland was settled on June 3rd in 1992 in Australia, and for the very first time, it recognized native title. It's often been described as a landmark decision, but it merely admits in legal form what to everyone was already an undisputable fact, that Australia was inhabited before it was colonized, and that therefore these inhabitants had claim to land. Marber, named after the land rights campaigner Eddie Marber, is often credited for overturning Terra Nullius, which is a legal phrase, a Latin phrase, a legal concept that translates as nobody's land. Most of us Australians were taught that it formed the legal pretext for British settlement of the Australian continent, but we were all taught wrong. Terra Nullius begins to frame the account of white settlement in Australia about 100 years after the arrival of the first fleet. So what Marber overturns then is not only a moral fiction and a legal fiction, but a historical one. The continent was not settled, it was conquered, and the conquerors knew it. So this is a map of Aboriginal languages in Australia. Like so many of the lies that linger around our history, Terra Nullius is a fig leaf cast back in time, eventually taken for a historical truth. One of the most pernicious lies is that Indigenous Australians lived in a state of subsistence. So according to this image of pre-colonial Indigenous society, life was little more than a harsh, unending struggle to satisfy primordial needs with very, very meager opportunities. And it's a more pernicious lie because it's one thing to admit to conquering, but it's another thing to admit that the conquered are your equals. Pre-colonial Australians did not live in a state of subsistence, and the ample time they allocated to their religious ceremonies is already proof of this. This is an image of the Brewarrina fish traps, an extremely complex set of weirs and dams, indeed a design project, an engineering project, an architectural project, we should say. What does the dam do? It collects fish in an enclosed pool so that Indigenous Australians, when they were hungry, could just go into the pool, pick up the fish and eat them. And we're discovering thousands of examples of these kinds of structures in Australia. In fact, there is a revolution taking place in Australia in terms of the way that we understand our own continent. And part of that is the work of incredible books like this, The Biggest Estate on Earth by Bill Gammage, and another important book called Dark Emu. So let me just say a few things about this book, because I think it's really important. So when I learned art history in Australia when in high school, yeah? So the classic understanding of Australian landscape painting is this. European painters arrive with the first fleet, yeah? And because their eyes are develop in a European context, they can't see the Australian landscape as it is, yeah? So they paint it as if it's a kind of European garden, yeah? And so then we're taught that in the 50s and 60s there's a revolution in Australian landscape painting as painters finally learn to see the Australian landscape with Australian eyes, yeah? In a sense, they decolonize their perspective. Bill Gammage does something incredibly interesting. He spends 15 years writing this book, and he takes these paintings, and he goes and he stands on the site that they were painted at, and he compares the painting to the landscape. And he goes through a series of settler diaries and starts reading what the diarists said about the landscape. And he makes the claim that the reason the Australian continent was painted by European painters as if it was an estate, a garden, was because it was. So what does that mean? So the thesis in this book is that the entire Australian continent is made up of a series of mosaics, and you can see them here. One of the mosaics is this small grove of bush, and then alongside that mosaic is a patch of open grass with very clear definition between one and the other. And they would continually set very, very small fires to the landscape. Yeah, so the Australian landscape evolves in relationship to fire over tens of thousands of years. As the new grasses came through after the burn-off, kangaroos, wallabies, and other marsupials would start to move through the landscape. Yeah? Indigenous Australians would hide in the bush, and they would hunt the marsupials as they moved. So what they were doing was they were coordinating the migration of marsupials through the landscape, through the strategic burning off of these patches in this mosaic that covered the entire Australian continent. That's already extraordinary. Another dimension to the story, which is then even more incredible. In each one of the language groups that I saw before, one of the members of the community would be allocated a totem. So the totem might be an animal or it might be a plant. Yeah? That person was responsible for the entire ecosystem that plant or that animal depended on for their survival. Yeah? It was their responsibility, their legal responsibility and obligation to look after it no matter what. What that meant was, if someone whose totem was an emu, yeah, or a kangaroo, say, went from one community to another community, they would be introduced to the person in that community who was also responsible for looking after that animal. So though they had different language groups, there was a transversal line that allowed them to connect ecological management of the land across the entire continent. Gammage's claim is that the only way to understand the Australian continent prior to settlement is as a single estate. Yeah? So the continent was designed. But what kind of design was it? It was a design that we couldn't recognize when white settlers arrived. Its ecologies were modified, its rivers were controlled, its fields were cultivated, its movements and cycles and rhythms were manipulated and harnessed in a grand choreography spanning thousands of years. How's that for an image of Australia? A vast intergenerational design project at the scale of an entire continent. So despite the evidence, as I said, white Australians couldn't recognize it. They still can't, but it's changing. Eventually, though, it too will become an indisputable fact. Let's take a recent piece of research on the veracity of oral testimony in Australia. So researchers conducted an experiment where they interviewed 21 different Aboriginal communities around the coast of Australia. And they asked them whether they had stories about the historical sea level, yeah? Whether they had, within their oral tradition, stories about where the shoreline used to be. And they found out that out of 23, and out of the 21 out of the 23 communities they interviewed accurately corroborated the exact position of the shoreline. Now, that might seem unremarkable, except that the sea levels that were being described were between 7,000 and 18,000 years old. Right? So think about that. That's an empirically verifiable story transmitted across 300 to 700 generations. So think about the kinds of social structure you require to accurately transmit stories that far in time. It's before the invention of writing, before the invention of language. So despite the time that's passed, and despite every attempt to silence the messages that they carry, despite everything that has happened on that island continent since 1788, those signals are still with us, and they can be made out if we're prepared to listen. If we're not prepared to listen, then this has been the consequence. So right now in Australia, there is a very, very politicized argument taking place about, on one side, people who are saying, we have to learn from Indigenous land management systems, yeah? Indigenous land management is not separate to the environment. The Australian environment has evolved around fire, yeah? Fire is a natural part of the Australian environment. And interestingly, the Prime Minister of the Conservative government that we have at the moment, who did he choose to attack? He chose to attack the authors of those 2 books that I showed you. Which shows you how dangerous those ideas are. Imagine, like, the Prime Minister to attack like a scholar writing a book about land management. And, you know, you've seen, this is Mount Kosciuszko in Australia after the fires. This is a complete apocalypse. Okay, so in 1993, in the aftermath of the Marber decision, the Native Title Tribunal was established in Australia. As you know, in Australia, the state is the sole source of law. That law, when it comes to property, consists of public verifiable statements, things like maps, surveys, title deeds. But there is another legal order in Australia in which the state is not the only source of law. But that legal order transmits its law orally. It's not written. It doesn't have maps. It doesn't have surveys. It doesn't have title deeds. It values secrecy and initiation rather than public statements. So what happens with the Native Title Act in Australia is that 2 radically different legal, moral, and ecological orders come into contact. Their encounter raises difficult questions about the past, present, and future of relationships between black and white Australians. So in 1993, a group of communities from the Great Sandy Desert met at Lampuwell. You see an image of it here. Lampuwell is on the northern end of the Canning Stock route, and they wanted to explore making a native title claim. The Land Council chairman at the time explained to the people that were assembled that under native title, the claimants would have to prove 3 things: their culture and their law, where they came from and who they were, and where they walked on the land. So over the next 4 years, community members working with anthropologists and the manager of the Art Resource Centre, Munkaja, would return to country and try to define the area of the native title claim. The claim area that they would eventually seek to win back was 83,860 kilometres squared, which is about twice the size of the Netherlands. But during this process, the question remained, how to establish in front of an Australian legal tribunal their culture, their law, where they came from, who they were? In other words, what, in the eyes of the Australian legal system, would constitute proof of the fact that they have had land tenure going back tens of thousands of years? Then they made the most startling decision. They decided to make a painting to prove their title claim. It would be the first, and so far the only time in Australian history that a painting would be entered as evidence of native title. But the artists also had to decide what kind of stories to share with each other, because there's 4 different communities, and each one has their own stories, and they're legally obliged to not share those stories with other people. Yeah? They also have to decide what to share with the Australian legal system, because of course there's huge amounts of distrust. Yeah? So what's really fascinating about this painting is that they decide to break their own law, yeah, to share the stories with each other, and to share them with the Australian public, or the Australian legal system, in order to win their land back, which makes this project, which makes the painting they eventually make completely contemporary. It's not a traditional painting. Then they make another really incredible decision. They decide that despite their linguistic differences and their cultural differences, they would paint water holes, yeah, because it's something they call jilla, yeah, because the water was the thing that would make all of their stories commensurate. Obviously, water is an incredibly valuable thing in the desert. So on May 9th, 1997, after 4 years of meetings, a group of more than 40 Aboriginal men and women from the Walmajiri, Wankajunga, Mangala and Juwalini communities get together at the Binini Outstation, which is about a 6-hour drive south of Fitzroy Crossing in the Great Sandy Desert. The plenary session with the Native Title Tribunal is just about 10 days away. The following day on May 10, Jimmy Pike, one of the artists, takes a brush and makes the first mark, drawing the line of the Canning stock route. It's the first line they make on the canvas, from one end of the canvas to the other. His fellow artists find their country, they sit down and they begin painting. In April 2019, I traveled to Western Australia to meet with the surviving artists and nominated descendants of the deceased artists. In fact, there's only, I think now, out of the original group of 40, I think there's only 6 surviving artists. At the Curryilly Education Centre in Fitzroy Crossing, you see an image of it here. I came to explain my ambitions for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial and to hear from them their ambitions for the canvas. We'd been working on the project for months, but from London, from the perspective of the RCA. I first learnt about the text the painting in a legal text by an anthropologist called Kirsten Anker, and I thought, there's no way this story can be true. How come I've never heard of it? And then, of course, it turns out that no one, or very few people have heard of the existence of this painting. I was thrilled when after months of discussion, they said, okay, we're happy to meet you. Terry Murray, you can see here, was the youngest of the painters in the canvas. He opened up the session with a minute's silence for all the people that had deceased, for all the previous generations who had been part of the canvas but who could not be there. And so from the very start, the whole idea of intergenerational rights could not have been expressed more powerfully. In fact, I really didn't need to explain the project to them in any way. They just got it. You see some more images of that discussion. Okay, so I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. After 10 days of painting in 1997, the 40 artists that had gathered in Benini to paint proof of intergenerational land tenure for the Australian Native Title Tribunal finished their work. The painting's called Nagar O2, and this is what it looks like. Nugara means the feeling you have when you're at home. Nugara Canvas 2 is so much more than a painting. It's a strategic intervention in a land rights claim, one that adopts and adapts traditional laws and stories about country to produce legal and political effects using aesthetic means. That makes it completely singular in the already rich tradition of Indigenous painting. So on one hand, it's a map in a cartographic sense because it can be said to point to things, and indeed that's also how they use it. But also in a very literal and material sense, it is their country. And so when they stand in it, they say that they're standing on country. It's how the law is expressed. It also talks about the way rights to tell stories are differentiated amongst different members of the community. It's a site for ceremonies of cleaning, of maintaining, of awakening. It's the embodiment of kin and the home of ancestors. It's in, like, those things are in the painting for them. It's a carpet. You can stand on it. You can dance on it. They let their dogs walk on it. There's a terrific story of a well-known Australian head of a very, very well-known institution in Australia coming to see the painting and being absolutely furious when he sees them walking on it. And he's like, you have to decide what it is. And what's so beautiful is that they don't have to decide about what it is. Yeah. In fact, it's undecidable. It's a unique, multivalent object, the likes of which I've never come across in my life, and that non-Indigenous people will only ever apprehend at the very edges of its meaning. With the painting completed, the artist insists that the hearing takes place on land. So in a kind of Werner Herzog, Fitzcarraldo-esque moment, the Australian legal system decamps to a remote site in the Australian desert to hear Cogolo versus the state government of Western Australia. Here you can see Fred Cheney, who was the deputy chair of the Native Title Tribunal at the time, arriving for the hearing. And as they're called to testify, the various artists walk over to the part of the painting that represents their country. They stand on it, and speaking either in English or one of the 4 Indigenous languages, they tell the story of their life. They tell the story of who they were, of how they moved through the country. They expressed their culture, their law, where they came from. One of the tribunal members says in the evidence at the time that it was the most eloquent and overwhelming piece of evidence that had been presented before an Australian legal system, before an Australian legal hearing. So here you can see the verdict, which takes place 10 years later in 2007. This is Justice Gilmore arriving to deliver the determination. Were they successful? Of course they were. In the course of delivering his judgment, Justice Gilmore says the following: "Can I say that in making these orders, that this court does not give you native title? Rather, the court determines that native title already exists. It determines that this is your land, that it is based upon your traditional laws and customs, and it has always been. The law says to all the people in Australia that this is your land and that it has always been your land." And we should add that it will always be their land into the future. An area of 80,000 square kilometres returned to its traditional owners using an 8 by 10 metre painting. It's not bad. I returned to Benini in August of last year. This is the site where it was painted. It's marked by these rocks on the ground in the spirit of talking about markings on grounds and the fantastic presentation that Jessica gave us before. This is Benini from the air. And so by a lucky twist of fate, the artists make a first painting. You notice it's called Nagar O2, yeah? So Nagar O1, they kind of muck up, yeah? Like by their own admission, they just don't get it right. But because it's the first edition, it gets acquired by the National Gallery of Australia, right? So the really important painting, Nagar O2, is one of the only collective works to remain in community ownership in Australia. And so their dream is to exhibit the canvas on the site where it was painted, which I just showed you before, in a remote part of the Australian desert, and to try to develop an economy around it, which is the project we're just about to start working on. So I returned to Benini to support this initiative. You can see some images. So the canvas arrived in the Sharjah Architecture Triennial. It was installed in one of the Sharjah Art Foundation spaces. It's going to be on display for another 9 days if you have time to come to Sharjah. And during the opening program, on the third day, there was an awakening ceremony, which you can see just some footage of here. And then completely spontaneously, the artists repeated what had taken place during the hearing, except this time it was, in a sense, very emotionally charged because it wasn't the artist, it was sometimes the artist's sons or sometimes the artist's daughters walking over to the spot in the country that their parents had painted and explaining to us what each part of the painting meant to them. Let me conclude by just talking about one very, very small aspect of the painting. So that blue circle with the white lines extending out from it is a jilla, a waterhole that's called Wulla. And that jilla, can you see that tiny little dot in the middle of that huge salt pan? Yeah? So that tiny dot is a hedge of grasses, which are about this high, in a circle which is almost exactly the same size as this circle here. So in the middle of this vast salt pan, all you can see is a clump of grass coming out of the ground. Inside that clump of grass is a jilla, and it looks like this. So what is absolutely extraordinary to my mind is that the scale of the jilla in the painting has got nothing to do with its dimension in real life, yeah? Because in fact, they're commensurate. They're almost the same size in the painting as it is in this 86,000 square kilometer area. But more than that, the white lines represent the pathways that people take entering the salt pan from every single direction to come to the jilla, yeah? The paths themselves, and you have to imagine a completely flat white surface, are a couple of millimeters deep, yeah? They're almost invisible, yeah? It's just very, very slight depressions. Each community follows that path because they know that that was the path their ancestors walked on to get to the jilla. And so what's really beautiful here is that it's rendered with the kind of clarity of, or the drama of a site that's so sacred that it forms the focus of an entire conceptual, legal, religious, and ritual system in one of the hottest and driest environments on the planet. And it has done so for tens of thousands of years. What signal does that transmit to us today? These small facts point us towards something which I think is very fundamental. In this painting, what we find is not just an archipelago of Jillas, but the materialization of an alternative mode of existence, an alternative set of understandings, of perceptions, of feelings between people and between those people and their country. The Sharjah Architecture Triennial brought together these various sites of social struggle to try to explain how precious these alternative modes of existence are, especially the way that they embody different ways of being in the world outside of the xenophobic, extractive, capitalist modes of relationship that currently dominate the world, that lead us to exhaustion and soon to extinction. The struggle of the Noongar people is one of countless struggles that occur across the global south. We are living in the twilight between worlds. The planet that we think we're living on no longer exists. Global temperature rises will soon make the centre of Australia unviable for human life. Soon, a second set of irreversible processes will lead Indigenous Australians to leave their country, mainly forever. Maybe forever. So today, all of the walls in the world, all of the refugee detention centres, all of the processing facilities, all of the exterminations and decimations of Indigenous cultures, all of the Trumps, all of the Bolsonaros, all of the Morrisons cannot insulate the global north from experiencing what it means to extinguish a world. Thank you.